Hey, I'm actor Chris Bartlett from The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you're watching Virtual Cantina Network.
Hello, and welcome to the 51st episode of the Unifying Force. I'm Kat, joined by Dave and Gio. How is everybody?
I am doing well.
Yeah, I'm doing okay. A little croaky because somehow I got a summer cold, but the UK's not really had much of a summer, so everyone's a little hoarse.
Yeah, I'm feeling laid up myself, but today we are going to discuss the concept, does every living being in Star Wars have the Force? As Yoda says, the Force is in all living things, but as we see throughout the series, not many people have the ability to wield it. But is that because they simply don't believe they can wield it, like Han Solo, who thinks, that's ridiculous, it doesn't exist? Or is it because many of them simply are undisciplined, like, initially? I mean, yeah, Luke has the whole chosen one bloodline, but he's like, you want the impossible, whereas other people are like, oh, rocks, lifting rock, got it. It's like, well, we don't really know, so we're here to discuss. Why don't you kick us off on this?
Okay, so this is inspired obviously by the new Ahsoka show. Okay, if you haven't seen it, spoilers, and you might want to turn it off and wait and go watch some Ahsoka. But in Ahsoka is Sabine Wren as Ahsoka's apprentice is being kind of ridiculed, made fun of, discouraged a little bit because she's not a highly sensitive Force user, and she feels this herself. I think is she kind of looks down on herself because she's not as amazing at using the Force. She's not there. Hu Yang, who is a robotic being, a droid who has seen the history of the Jedi. He's who Jedi go to, younglings go to make their lightsabers. He's like really snarky at her, and he's just like, almost like, you see this rock here, it has more of the Force than you do. And he's about that way, yet she is still being trained in the ways of the Jedi. Ahsoka has agreed to take her on as her apprentice again. We've seen Sabine in Star Wars Rebels being trained by Kanan, and in the use of the Darksaber, and how you need to feel it, really. You can't just wield it like a weapon, which we've again seen that thing about the Darksaber in The Mandalorian, where Din Djarin like immediately does what every single one of us would do given a lightsaber, which is cuts himself. Himself immediately, because it's heavy. It's hard to wield without feeling. So is Sabine Force sensitive, or are they, pun intended, forcing this, being a Force user upon her? And then everybody else does it matter? Has everybody got the Force? Could everybody be trained to use it?
Gio?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that's open for democratic debate because there is no specific black or white answer. We've had a couple of characters that the stories have centered on where they've been very powerful with the Force, and that's kind of been the way they end up being the the hero in their story and go through this kind of journey through a trilogy of films. And so it's interesting that Ahsoka, even though we have the eponymous character, Ahsoka Tano, is the main focus and draw to us as fans and new audiences coming in to watch the show. It's Sabine's sensitivity to the Force, or maybe lack thereof, that feels like it's a major story beat already. And I think it's good how we've got the context of a droid, because that's interesting in itself, because there's always that whole kind of question in Star Wars of like droid rights and droid sentience, and are they treated fairly? And you can kind of gauge the character of a new person in Star Wars very quickly, especially in some of the newer material, by how they treat droids. And as soon as you know that they're disparaging to a droid, it's like, okay, well, that's not a nice guy or not a nice lady. And in the same way that droids are kind of used in this almost like a race relations kind of way, especially in Solo, I felt like they tried to tap into that a little bit, which kind of diverged from Han Solo's origin story in a way. But the fact that you had a droid that was sentient that ends up becoming part of the Millennium Falcon, the reason why I mentioned this, it might sound like a massive tangent, but it goes into what George Lucas was saying when he came up with the idea of midichlorians, because in the same way that we have actually forgotten the name of Phoebe Waller-Bridge's character in Solo, the droid. The name
L3.
Yes, when L3 hooks herself into the Millennium Falcon and becomes one with the Falcon, it's almost similar to how the symbiotic relationship George Lucas used as an analogy to describe what he created with the idea of midichlorians, that they sound like they're little organelles within cells of every living thing. So they're everywhere. They are in physically, literally, and figuratively in us, but they're in everything that's made up in the world around us, elementally, and almost in a biochemistry kind of way. So in that sense, everything that's alive should have connection to the Force and have some sort of slight presence of the Force within it. And what kind of became controversial in The Phantom Menace was the couple of lines where we're talking about an M count and something very kind of hard and empirical and numerical to kind of determine how strong in the Force someone is, how good they are at the Force, or what kind of Force potential they may have ahead. We had that with Qui-Gon taking a blood sample from Anakin, literally just takes his blood in the scene and sends it back to have it analyzed. And Obi-Wan is actually the character who is first stunned with the idea that Anakin's midichlorian count is over 20,000, and that's unheard of apart from with Master Yoda. It immediately kind of contextualizes levels of the Force, as well as almost indicating that and confirming what Obi-Wan first told Luke and what Yoda reinforced in Luke on Dagobah, which is that the Force is everywhere and in everything.
See, I think what you're talking about is what's really the impetus for the Sabine arc, is that midichlorian count and the fact that there's levels. Like, it hasn't been said for every Force user throughout but if you want to get down to it, they're saying Sabine doesn't have the talent. I'd love to know, and I don't know if we will get revealed what's like an M count on her. What would be her compared to Obi-Wan, compared to, because Obi-Wan is a very powerful Force user, but not nearly in the way. He's more of a practiced user as opposed to Anakin, who is natural, or Rey, who is completely just untrained. And it just seemed like Obi-Wan masters the Force and is powerful in the Force through his training, not necessarily his M count. I think that very notion of there being a scale of things is where this current kind of dilemma and situation may have come from.
Yeah. And then furthermore, when you look into Clone Wars Season 6, when Yoda actually goes to the heart of the galaxy and you actually see how the whole entire concept works, and that everybody kind of has it in there, but I think that part of it is also breaking the fourth wall. That whatever the needs of the script are, they'll say this character has it versus this character doesn't.
Mhm.
Whereas Huang is a guy who's obviously programmed to train Jedi or to assess Jedi specifically for the old Jedi Order, not this post-Empire world. Which is why Ahsoka keeps pushing back on him when he says, "Oh, Sabine's not really cut out for this," or blah blah blah. He's like, "Yeah, she is." So I would say that everybody kind of has it, but I think attitude has a lot to do with it. Whether or not you want to reach out has a lot to do, because again, in the prequel trilogy, Anakin having a high M count has no bearing on any of his abilities. Qui-Gon didn't think there was something special about him because he could race pods. He's like, "Oh, you must have Jedi reflexes if you race pods." Not that it had to be a 20,000 count. So it's only because other characters put stock in the idea of him having a high M count meaning something that things go the way they do. Point being that anybody technically could have the Force, but I don't think that with the Tamiri Blag character, the Broom Boy, as they call him, had anything to do with saying, "Oh, anybody can have it," because that was already established in the prequel trilogy. Because if you happen to, because plenty of kids who go to the Jedi Temple are not from, Jedi families or anything, or Force fielding families.
Not necessarily hereditary.
Force user family, because Force users technically aren't supposed to have attachments and have families. That may be one of the reasons
Jedi aren't, but
Leia are right. Jedi are not. Why Luke and Leia are so powerful? It's there, but
the Jedi in the prequel trilogy aren't, because we have different eras of Jedi and different kind of interpretations of the whole thing.
So what about if you're saying, Qui-Gon notices that Anakin has this kind of Jedi reflexes and things? Does that mean that great pilots in the galaxy, Anakin is a great pilot because of this? Does Han Solo have the Force? Is he tapping into the Force when he's a great pilot? Does Hera Syndulla, when she makes all these maneuvers and things, are they tapping into and using the Force without knowing it?
I don't think necessarily being able to do something without formal training indicates that it's a Force thing. A lot of people can do things without formal training. Even in the real world, a lot of people, or some of the biggest geniuses, aren't college educated. So there's that. But like Sabine being a good pilot, it's also when people say, hyperbole, "Oh, you're a really great pilot," or "You're a great mechanic." It's like, or Han Solo having an inflated opinion of himself, saying, "Oh, I'm the best pilot in the galaxy," that kind of stuff. So there's that. Like, again, going back to Luke in the original trilogy, it's like, yes, we find out retrospectively from the prequels that he's got the chosen one blood in him, but that doesn't give him any more of an easier time learning how to use it, and that's mostly because of his own attitude, and he doesn't have amazing superpowers at the time. So the Force, I think it's kind of like what Nikola Tesla used to think about. Like, he didn't think there was such things as atoms that you couldn't even split an atom. He thought that all of life, that there was some type of electronic ether, like an invisible ether that was penetrating everything in the same way. That's why he thought he could use his Wardenclyffe Tower as a massive wireless signal to provide free electricity everywhere. But he was underestimating the amount of electricity. No, that's not going to work. There's not that much electricity. There's no ether. That's kind of like what the Force is in Star Wars, right? It's like this ether that's created everything. Because again, we remember the heart of the galaxy from Clone Wars Season 6. This is where the life emanates from. And some life forms are going to have the ability to manipulate it and others won't. But just because you don't have the ability to manipulate it doesn't mean you don't have your own essence of the Force is there, because it's basically this ether that exists in all living things throughout the universe.
Yeah.
So here's the real world argument that I'll give to you, and why I believe that all beings do have the Force is I'm going to go ahead and say that, and I'll come right out and just go. I am, for viewers that don't know, I'm an elementary school art teacher. Okay. And I fully believe and say on a regular basis, everyone is an artist. And everyone under the age of 7 completely believes that, and everything that comes out of their pen or their pencil or their crayon is the best thing ever. Only when you become older, past 7, or adults who will come in, I can't draw a straight line without a ruler. Well, you're not supposed to be able to. That's what rulers are for. Yeah. Everyone has the ability to be an artist, it does require to make one better at it. It can require some more training. Yes, there are those who have innately more natural talent, either in visual arts or in music or whatnot. There are those that are innately better, but there are those who have chosen not to train themselves, who don't believe that they can, you know. And that's the kind that's where I'm at on this. Is I think it's belief in oneself. Another future episode that we could potentially do is, you mentioned Luke has this hard time learning to use the Force because hasn't believed in it, or that he had it, or he had any sort of ability for his first 18 years. A what if that we could do? What if Luke and Leia had been raised by Anakin, a very powerful Force user? Would they have just immediately begun to use the Force much earlier and been much more powerful, much quicker? Who knows?
I think it does come back to a kind of question on, I think, attitude. What Catherine said is a really good aspect of this that I didn't really think of phrasing it that way in seeing and describing how the Force is used to kind of attribute talent levels and power levels in the Star Wars galaxy. I think the ability to harness the Force in a way is kind of like an analogy to talents, but that doesn't, as we just discussed, doesn't necessarily mean that anyone who's talented in the Star Wars galaxy is tapping into, you know, a higher form of power to give them a greater ability than the average person. But it can be that. And I guess it does come back also to what Catherine was saying. If the story requires it, it's a convenient way of saying, okay, so this is how this person is unbelievably incredible at this very specific thing. Where it starts to stretch the credulity a little bit more is when you end up having one character who's awesome at everything straight away. And that's one of the problems that The Force Awakens had with Rey, because she did seem to be not only a very fast learner and very resourceful and very scrappy, and, you know, had like a completely resilient attitude. She was an orphan and is basically homeless and literally scrounging for scraps just to eat day by day, and counting the days with a physical impromptu calendar on a wall. And yet she doesn't give up. And I think that's where the attitude part comes in. Rey, I would say, is able to awaken in the Force because she has this kind of core inner strength and resilience that might be because of her life experiences. Even though she's still quite young, she's obviously been through a lot of traumatic things. She's had some very deep, dark moments in her childhood either erased or she's tried to wipe them out, and then we get some of that back in flashbacks. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the Force is telling her these things. The way the vision was used in The Force Awakens, I thought was really intriguing, because anytime we have a visual manifestation of the Force on screen, I mean, in theory, I would be a little bit afraid because I think, oh, don't mess it up too much. In the same way that some people might think midichlorians and sciencing the Force.
Speed Force.
Yeah, or in other multiverses and other franchises and IPs, there's there's like a wishy-washy explanation, and sometimes they're like, oh, they just scienced it. And I mean, there's that awful line in New Star Trek about using science and like science is cool, or physics is, I don't even remember. I don't want to say it. The line's not working.
I love the one in like the supposedly real world property, The Martian, where Matt Damon is like, how do we survive? We science the shit out of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's good because that's real world and you can kind of get away with saying that. I guess you could in Star Wars, but it would upset a lot of people. I think that George Lucas kind of had this idea of something very mystical and spiritual initially, and maybe he felt that, you know, a generation of people weren't really holding on to Star Wars, the Force concept in the way that he wanted, or maybe he thought that the new generation, everyone's kids from those who got to see 1977 Star Wars in the cinema, maybe he felt that the idea of belief systems, higher powers, the concept of faith and possibly religion wasn't cool anymore, but science was really cool. Everything was becoming more technologically advanced. We're getting more numerical, we're getting more evidence-based in the 90s. He's writing it in the mid-90s. He's seeing how technology and computing is changing the way he made Star Wars with the prequel trilogy entirely differently.
Yeah.
But still, that's complete and fantastic talent from George Lucas's part, which circles me back into this idea of talent being kind of an analogy to the Force. And Ahsoka does mention that talent is important, but it only gets you so far, and it's perseverance and discipline that really take you all the way. And that's why I really like just saying, the term attitude, the mindset, the kind of inner. You got to have this kind of true grit in you to be able to get by in the Star Wars galaxy. We see that with all the main characters. Han Solo, he's a grafter, he's scrappy, he's resilient. We didn't need a Solo film to tell us that. We kind of knew that implicitly. Chewie as well, the fact that he's just a gigantic, 7 foot plus, lion bear. He clearly just visually, the design of things in Star Wars, whether it's the human characters or the non-human characters, tell us a lot about, what they're about visually and symbolically. And I think the Force, you can kind of discuss it in two ways. There's what the symbolism of what it might mean on a personal, spiritual level, which I think is what George Lucas originally went for and very much underlined in The Empire Strikes Back with Yoda. The whole idea of Yoda, like literally the puppet of Yoda squeezing Mark Hamill's deltoid, being like, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. And he's literally like checking his, like feeling the muscle fibers. I think that's one of the most powerful lines in Star Wars. And I don't think it matters whether you have a belief in something greater than yourself in the real world or personally. I just think the concept of thinking that there's something internal that's the same in everyone and everything, I think that conveys a sense of peace and a sense of harmony. And I think that's what a lot of people look for just generally in life. And sometimes you look for escapism in films, or maybe confirmation of your feelings as visually and, in terms of dialogue and sound portrayed by a filmmaker in a TV show or a film, or maybe even a video game nowadays. You kind of look for confirmation of these feelings that I have that might be complex or conflicting. Does somebody else feel that too? And they could be in a galaxy far, far away, looking out to the horizon, wondering, will I ever fulfill my dreams, or am I destined to just keep chugging along day by day? And that's one of that goes for Luke and for Rey.
That's one of the greatest things I like about this whole Sabine arc in Ahsoka is they're making Sabine the everyman. They're, as a part of her training, she is doing what every single one of us that have ever watched Star Wars have attempted to do. Is she's trying to, her practice is to move the cup. And if you haven't tried to use the Force to bring the remote across the room, I don't know who you are and why you're watching this show.
Yeah, it's a rite of passage.
Exactly. Everybody is just like.
Mine's with the doors, the automatic doors. I've always since age 3, 4.
That's the thing. Everyman too is I love the story where Ewan McGregor will walk through automatic doors and he does the Obi-Wan finger. He just yes, that's
what you want. It's good when you find out the characters in real life, the actors that portray them, the performers have that kind of belief as well. Yeah, the same thing that matches the character. Drives it home.
That is the greatest. So let me pose this other kind of question it's along the lines. So you mentioned that George in the original trilogy kind of had this set down as the Force was this kind of mysticism. Okay, let's throw that forward a little bit let's change the word into magic. So is the Force magic? Is magic the Force? Because another thing coming in that's been in the Clone Wars that we mentioned earlier, that's in Ahsoka now, we have the Night Sisters. Are the Night Sisters magic users? or are they Force users, or is it the same thing?
Might be both. They never really specify how they're able to do what they do, but it's a dark side power, it looks like. But they also have like cauldrons and witches potions and stuff. So
Yeah, there's a lot of green. There's a lot of green light and smoke in where they live, so I feel like they visually were trying to indicate that's a kind of different thing. And yeah, I think we might find out very soon.
We
Through
may.
what Dave Filoni's saying, showing us. But it's interesting that you've got this idea of them being extra galactic now, because that's genuinely opening Pandora's box to anything, really. And when Morgan says that to our two Dark Force warriors in Baylor and Shin, they kind of are. I mean, Shin's initially very suspicious. She's like, "Oh, you're a witch," and she kind of just gives her an even colder stare than the cold stare she's by default given everyone so far. And Morgan just seems to be very at peace with it and is kind of just takes it in her stride. Yeah, I'm from the Night Sisters Dathomir, but the way she describes, I think the line is, doesn't mention Night Sisters again. She says that my people originally came from elsewhere. It might mean that, we're going to see some kind of evolution in this cult or magic using group who can tap into the Force. The way we saw them in the Clone Wars might not be how they originally were on a different planet in a different galaxy. So we might have some extra kind of shades of gray between the kind of idea of magic and that we completely have in high fantasy. And in pretty much every high fantasy, there's this kind of magic or mana or something like that. And sometimes it's a physical substance. Sometimes it's completely invisible and mystical. And the Force, as far as we know, there's no physicality towards it, but it can impose itself on physical things, like moving rocks, summoning the TV remote. And I think what I really like about George Lucas's idea for the Force is that I don't think anything he says in justifying midichlorians and the Phantom Menace goes against the mysticism he originally put out there. Because if you look at quantum physics now, we have the search for, the theory of everything. We are looking for what people term God particles. We are looking at the intersection of mass and energy and how they are interchangeable, but they came about at the same time and nobody knows how that happened. But the same mass and energy in the universe right now, and that has made up the elements that make up our atoms and our cells, was there at the beginning of everything, at the beginning of the universe. And that's incredible. And a little shout out to Rogue One, because Galen Erso says this concept to Jin in that hologram, that we are all stardust. And that genuinely is the same physical, scientific, and biochemical explanation for everything that we have. And it was just neatly inserted into Star Wars. And I really appreciated that, because the way I see things in the real world is, I don't think if you have belief in something that is unfounded or that you cannot measure, such as a belief in a higher power, in God, in some kind of creative energy that started everything, I don't see that as automatically opposing science and maths and things that you can measure and have evidence for. I think there's very much they can be complementary to each other, and often it's the method of communication and the method of trying to share knowledge is inadequate or inefficient, and that leads to people kind of thinking, science and belief, they kind of butt heads, and you cannot be a man of faith and a man of science. This is like a dilemma that Galileo had. It's a dilemma that Stephen Hawking talked about, but it's one that everyone kind of answers for themselves. There's no right or wrong. It's just, what do you choose to believe?
Well,
and in Star Wars, it's similar.
I was right before the show, coincidentally watching a TikTok by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who, arguably modern day Galileo. Okay. And he's talking about the scientific community and the use of you have to use BCE, before the Common Era, as opposed to BC or CE, the Common Era, or ACE, is removing the religion from scientific papers. And he's like, I won't do it. I still write BC and AD in my scientific papers, because the calendar that we use that said BC or AD was created by Gregorian monks. It was created by the Catholic Church. So I don't care what you say and what you want to say in changing like a letter in this, is you have to give nod to where that came from. Is leave it be. Is it was created by the church, acknowledge why it was created by the church, acknowledge that the Gregorian calendar is an amazing calendar that we still use to this day, so many years later, that it's fine. Is so there, what I'm saying is there's a place for the witchcraft in there. There's a place for the Jedi really religion. If you want to go back, we've talked about that on several shows in the early days of the Unifying Force, is Jedi as a religion. Jedi is a religion in the real world. You can declare yourself on the census in several countries. You can declare yourself a Jedi and go on about your business. Whether you can grab the remote or move the remote, or whether you can, easily handle a saber or not. You can be any of those things. So you mentioned Rogue One here, and I love how you tied in real world and the physics of the Stardust and that. So there's several characters in Rogue One there that we could talk about as well. So Chirrut Imwe, obviously a religious man, blind, an amazing, cunning warrior who creates feats like he could potentially see or have some knowledge of the world around him. Is that the Force? Is that training? Is that, he's constantly believes in the Force and uses that mantra, but doesn't consider himself a Force user. But is he anyway?
Kat, what do you think? Would you count him as a Force user? Or a believer?
Well, he might be, and they just didn't show it, and in that movie, because he clearly not only believes in it, he feels that he's channeling it, like when he walks out to hit the switch, and like maybe he is channeling the Force to protect himself from all of the blasters and everything. They have the joke earlier when he's like, "Oh, the Force will protect me," and Baze is like, "Dude, I'm the one protecting you."
Yeah.
And it's like part of that is true, but maybe there's more to it than that, because they never really. Because on the one hand, they're the defenders of the Kyber Crystal Temple, but also guardians of the Wills, which sound like two different things. So, and they never really cleared that up, which is a bit odd. But he also knew sitting in that street market, that Jyn Erso was there. And she's far on the other side. She's not making a sound, and he's blind, but he knows she's there.
Yeah.
And so he's like...
And he knows that she's wearing the crystal around her neck as well.
Yeah, he knows that. So it's like... Yeah. The crystals, as we know, have like their own voices, so to speak. Like they speak to the Jedi. So it's like it's speaking to Chirrut. That's why he's drawn to her, because he knows there's something important about this. So even though they don't show him overtly using the Force, he may be one. But actually, he probably doesn't use it that much, because otherwise Baze would probably believe it. Because Baze doesn't come to believe that until Chirrut dies. So apparently the voices were speaking to him.
Right. I think it goes into George Lucas was, when he wanted to justify midichlorians again. I know I kind of keep going back to this, but I think it's a really central part, because it's kind of one of the big mechanics for how Star Wars works. And it was a huge part of underlying the prequels without being like a very obvious part of the prequels. And if we talk about timelines, episodes 1 to 3 are kind of the middle of all of Star Wars in terms of what's been created so far. And I think that maybe he felt that, as I was saying before, the Force was a little too abstract and a little too airy-fairy. And I don't mean that disparagingly. I just mean that because it's an intangible thing and it's a belief-based thing and it's invisible. Maybe he felt that 90s kids onwards wouldn't really dig that, because lots of people were, identifying as maybe not being people who believe in anything, agnostic or atheist, but very much science was almost becoming in a cult, a cult type way as well. Like this is what Neil deGrasse Tyson has said before, in that you get these big cliques and cults within the scientific community about who decides, like what's worth researching and investing in for research and development, because in the end, it just comes down to nobody in astrophysics or quantum physics knows has any definitive answers to everything, and everyone's kind of searching for like a tiny subpart of a question. Like if the exam sheet for life is questions 1 to 100, then one scientist will be looking at question number 7, part A, ... 3 or something, and there's not this great unifying thing that brings everything together. And that's maybe why George Lucas had this idea of descriptively also the Force. He let the EU writers go with this a little bit more than he described in the films, that there was the idea of the cosmic force, which is everything kind of grand and planetary and nebula, and to do with the cosmology and astronomy, the planets, the stars, the galaxy itself, and the energy that powers everything and connects all of that. And then there's the living force, what you feel, which is what sentient life feels, and allows you to, identify the space between the rock and the ship and the tree, as Yoda describes with Luke. And the two things together bring about the idea of the unifying force, which is coincidentally the name of our show. But the idea behind it is that there's like a fundamental truth underpinning everything. And in the Star Wars galaxy, it's the fact that there is something that is kind of unknowable, but some people choose to study and train specifically in it. And I would even go so far as to say you could look at the Jedi Order as almost like the cliquey scientists that you get in the modern era, wanting to kind of make it a very specific discipline, have a very, almost ordained set of rules. They want, the subatomic particle they're looking at in a gigantic accelerator, which is millions of dollars in, the US or in Switzerland. They want to look at one tiny, tiny, tiny aspect of it, which is kind of very, very far away from anything that's relevant to the average person living their life. But in some way, they're hoping to find a meaning and connection in that. And in the same way, in Star Wars, the Jedi say that they're keepers of peace and justice and kind of guardians for the galaxy, but in a way, the way we've seen them in the prequels in the Old Republic, they seem to be a little bit obsessive, a little bit cliquey, very dogmatic. And it's not just kind of organized religion that can be dogmatic. You can have any kind of belief system or organizational thing in life, whether it's economics or physics, that can be dogmatic as well. And that's where you run into problems because people aren't really open-minded anymore. And I think that's maybe what George Lucas was getting at, trying to bring in a scientific explanation to the Force, saying that there are many ways you can look at the Force and none of them are right or wrong. But the key thing is there's a belief there. And that's what Luke failed in when he tried to lift the X-Wing out of the Dagobah swamp. And that is what he eventually succeeded in The Rise of Skywalker, and demonstrated that to Rey, inspiring Rey to then ultimately save the galaxy.
That's the exact thing is like, I can't, it's too big. This is why you fail. There's a lot of questions in there that I want to respond to. Okay, like first is Chirrut Imwe. I'm like, I am totally of two minds on this character, is because of my love for Star Wars is I would go ahead and say, yeah, obviously it's a blind guy, he's doing all these things, it's a superpower, it's like Daredevil, but it's the Force, he's doing that, is he can see through the Force. But then my absolute love for kung fu movies and which is kung fu and samurai movies and that sort of thing is an original inspiration of George for Star Wars. Based on that, it's like, no, you could do that with human powers. He's listening, he's developed this attuned ear and he can feel the breeze coming by, he's the motion of the air and the hearing and all of these things. Now that gives explanation for everything other than the fact that he can apparently hear a kyber crystal across the courtyard. That's got to be the Force. So, you know, I am a supporter of both, but I lean towards it may well be the Force. And I like how you said in that thing that are the Jedi scientists. You know, we've argued before the Jedi are monks and they've trained into this. It's their belief system that elevates them in the power of the forces. That's what they study all the time. They train themselves, like Ahsoka is trying to tell Sabine. But that may well have been kind of an original trilogy idea. Is that's what it is here. They're monks, they're religious. It's that belief in the Force that creates that. Whereas in the 90s, when the prequel trilogy came out, you had to give it a little bit more of a scientific spin and make it quantifiable in some manner, just to be relatable. I think a lot of these things come to kind of what Kat was alluding to. It's what the story needs it to be. If the story in the 70s, people are, you know, it's very shortly after the Beatles went to India, and you know, it's mysticism and that sort of things, and that's what's in there. That's what George wrote the OT about. If it's in the 90s and we need to identify with this generation that's got to have, that sees everything and it's facts and it's science and it's quantifiable, that's what it is there. You know, there's a lot of misses and things, and I don't know if I can identify what it is in the sequel trilogy is what I don't know if I can identify it. I don't know if I know what the deal was. I think it was kind of a mishmash of different things. You've mentioned some things. It's like, yes, Rey immediately tuned into the Force, boom, because she believes in herself, she can go. We almost saw that, I think, the natural Force ability with Finn, but it was just like written away and just put in a
disappointingly.
Right. I was looking forward to that kind of thing. Is just, he's not related to anyone that we know of. I mean, Rey has this power because she has the Jedi or Sith. She has that Force user lineage. Finn, that we know of, doesn't. He's like Broom Boy. He's got a natural aptitude for the Force. Where did it come from? And I would have liked to have seen that played out so much more. Will we see some more of that, please, oh please, oh please, when they make the new Jedi Order movie that starring Daisy Ridley? When we see Rey trying to reform the Jedi Order, please let Finn be there and do something other than saying Rey, please. You know, where will it be, and what will the next thing that the Force needs to be? We talk all the time about how Star Wars is different for different people. There's so many different genres in Star Wars. There's so much different about it. All of these answers can be, could be, should be the right one. Who are some other potential Force users, maybe not Force users, things that happen in the Force? What else is there out there that we should be talking about?
I guess the ones from Mortis, if they do exist, who knows? Obviously, kind of deities in the Force, almost superpowered in a way. So the father, the son, and the daughter from Mortis is what we're referring to. A huge part of a really good arc in the Clone Wars Season 3, and it becomes relevant in Star Wars Rebels. In case anyone's not seen that, really worth seeing. Because it becomes a way to explain something that's even more mystical and far out there and very trippy, which is the idea of space and time and pathways and doorways existing in what's called the world between worlds, something that we might see more of in Ahsoka as well.
Well, again, is that magic? Is that the Force? Are they gods? And is that different? Or do gods have the Force? Does God, does Buddha, does Vishnu, or is that the Force? Is that a different thing entirely?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if anyone refers to that in Star Wars Galaxy. Maybe it's somewhere in the ancient Jedi texts, the ones that Yoda burned in the tree. What a shame. But the one thing I actually do want to bring up. So, in terms of Force users, we can look at the different groups. You got the Night Sisters, you have the Gods of Mortis, the Lords of Mortis. You have obviously the Jedi and the Sith. You have different little groups through what is now Star Wars Legends expanded universe. There were different tribes. There's a Clone Wars novel called Shatterpoint that focuses on Mace Windu, and it's essentially it's kind of like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness or Apocalypse Now, but in Star Wars. And I mean that in the best way, but also in the way that you must persist with the novel because it's a very slow burn initially. But in that storyline, there's a native indigenous population on this very densely overgrown planet, where Mace Windu's Padawan, Deepa Balaba, goes missing, and he hears echoes through the force of her calling out to him, but they're very eerie and almost witch-like and very magical and hallucinatory. So he's not sure what's real and what might be the Force telling him things or her specifically reaching out to him. But the indigenous tribes on that planet use the Force, but they don't refer to it as the Force. They have a particular group of warriors who are exceptional, and one of them goes toe to toe with Mace Windu a few times. And I just pictured essentially someone who's as big and intimidating as the Predator from those films, but someone who uses organic weapons and things that are made of like skull and bone, as well as technology to get the edge on opposition. And in the novel, those characters have heightened reflexes, additional speed and strength, and are a lot more acrobatic than an average indigenous tribe member would be. And it's because Mace Windu decides that they are using elements of the Force, and when they're enraged and attack in anger, he identifies that as the dark side, and he counters it with his lightsaber form, which was definitely an EU thing, but George Lucas has made it kind of official and canonized, that Mace Windu used a Form 7 lightsaber style, which he kind of created or honed and was already made, that taps into channeling the dark side and any kind of negative energy and feeling you have through you as a conduit, and then releasing it. So the dark side can literally travel through you, but you do not become corrupted by it. You are simply a vessel. You're almost like a jug of water, and it's hot water that's kind of boiling, but you just tip it right out onto your opponent with a lightsaber. And that's actually how the same author, Matthew Stover, describes Mace Windu somehow overpowering Darth Sidious, the Emperor Palpatine, in Revenge of the Sith. Which is, there's nothing like that in the film, sadly, but the idea is that Mace Windu simply reflects the dark side and the hatred and anger that Palpatine is pouring at him back in his face in the duel, and then very literally with the lightning. So that's an interesting use of the Force, I think, as well, because again, with Force powers, you've got them in the video games. They're physical manifestations of this magic and this mysticism, and that's interesting because you could argue originally it was just the Emperor that had Force lightning, but then to make the game seem fun, you wanted to have more villains have Force lightning, and then Darth Vader wasn't the only one who could Force choke. Everybody could do a little bit of it, and even Yoda and Luke at times have kind of Force pushed very violently / Force choked people, and not succumbed to the dark side. So
Force push, light side. Force choke, dark side.
Dark side, yeah.
Push, light, choke, dark. Let me start off with like the response there saying that I would watch so much a remake of Apocalypse Now with Star Wars characters. I mean,
Yeah.
Luke as Martin Sheen, I don't know, like Vader as Brando, and Harrison Ford, Han Solo could be Han Solo. He's in that movie, isn't he? He could be like Colonel whatever he was. So everything, I'd watch that. That would be something to see. But yeah, I love the concept that Mace is like treading a little bit on the light side and the dark side. Is I love the concept of he's got a purple lightsaber because it's blue and it's red and it's together. It's not just because Samuel L. Jackson wanted a purple lightsaber. I like the retcon explanation for that. Okay. And I think there's a lot of stuff in the Clone Wars and even the Clone Wars micro series that really kind of gives that explanation and gives those things that extra depth to Mace Windu. I love that. So more in the use of the Force, and what we'll see is Broom Boy. Is it the reason? Are they generally trying to say in canon was the entire point in that's been thrown away is the Sabine arc showing us that, or is it just coincidence, happenstance?
It's showing us what?
Yeah,
He's showing us that anyone can have the Force like Broom Boy, or
that's not what the Broom Boy thing is, though. It's like the Broom Boy is simply reminding people of the fact in the prequel trilogy that Force people didn't come from famous families; they were just regular people, and it's just simply showing that there's another, that this kid has the Force, and he's inspired by what Luke did, because that scene begins with them telling the story of how Luke, projected across the galaxy, and now that story is spreading itself across the galaxy, that was going to lead into what should have been the all-out rebellion at the start of episode 9, rather than them still being on their last legs. That was the point. Luke came back and did what he needed to do to inspire people to rise up again, like galaxy-wide. And JJ didn't understand that simple metaphor thing, and a lot of people looked at that and thought there was something deeper. It's like, no, it's just a simple, like, the kids are telling the story. The kids they're mythologizing Luke at his,
the way we have in the real world,
spreading it, and the fact that he can grab the broom of the Force is just showing, like, well, like Anakin was a Force kid, and all the other kids who joined, like Ahsoka at one point, said, oh, she had the Force, and it's not necessary. Nobody ever says that every single person is suddenly going to have the ability to manipulate it. That still comes down to, again, the needs of the script, or it's going to come down to if people, like, they're shying away from the whole M count thing, but that was never. I mean, it's like Sabine being able to do it. They teased that through Rebels as well. So, like, she has the potential, just nobody was there to try and nurture it at all. So
see, that's an argument that is fought a lot on Rebels Revisited, is the ridiculous, like, crazy jumping and parkour that Sabine does all the time, the natural talent for this and that, the ability to very quickly, easily wield the darksaber with just, this much instruction from Kanan. Are all those things leading to Sabine being potentially Force sensitive?
Doesn't the darksaber also choose the wielder, who they think is,
there is that element of it. There's like
someone who would make a great leader.
Yeah, there's a myth associated with that. Yeah,
I mean, I would assume the same thing, because it has a kyber crystal, like all lightsabers, and the crystal chooses the user.
It's like the reason. Yeah, it's like the reason Din Djarin had such a hard time with it is because he has no desire to lead. And it's like, that's not what, and so it doesn't like him. Yeah.
And the reason Bo-Katan, it didn't go so well, is because she wanted it too much. It's choosing someone who is doing it for the betterment of the Mandalorian people, as opposed to the betterment of themselves. That's why it was gifted to Bo, and it didn't go well, because that's not what the saber, the crystal, wanted.
Like Mjolnir in the MCU.
Yeah, you got to be worthy in a way.
Worthy of wielding it.
Yeah, and I think wielding is a really good verb to use as well, because it's what Ahsoka uses a couple of times in these first 3 chapters of her show that we've seen, that she alludes to the fact that the Force is accessible to everyone, but only some people can wield it well. And she still, it's her belief and conviction this time, it's the Master's belief in her reluctant apprentice that is the initiating kind of catalyst to her beginning her training again. And sure, she has a very sarcastic sassy droid who is belittling her massively. But I almost take what Huyang says with a pinch of salt, because I see that as an homage to K2SO, or from Rogue One, or to HK-47, the original sassy assassin droid from the Knights of the Old Republic video games. And I think it just adds a different tone and some levity and some humor. I don't think that Huyang genuinely thinks Sabine is absolutely useless and the worst Padawan ever. I think droids can have emotions, and he's getting his kicks out of that.
We could see he's trying to use reverse psychology on her. He's trying to put her down to
he's
like
playing
piss
4D
her
chess.
off.
Yeah,
exactly. He's like trying to sit there, and he knows he's had the amount of experience.
I don't think so, because of the conversation that he has privately with Ahsoka up in the cockpit, where she says, "Why are you banging on this?" He's like, "Well, she doesn't match the description for the basically the checklist for the Jedi Order." And Ahsoka's like, "The Jedi Order is gone. It failed." And he's like, "But she needs to be. You need to make this checklist." Like, well, meeting that checklist caused it to fail, and they failed.
I thought that was really great writing. It was a really good commentary on essentially the problem with the Jedi in the prequels, and how they kind of got hustled by Palpatine and ended up serving the dark side by leading a war.
Well, that's the same thing with, I think, the whole midichlorian thing. I think that got blown out of proportion by the fans, where it was making the point that the Jedi Order is they've been so corrupted by their own inner politicking and stuff like that, that they're looking to, let's look at your blood count and stuff like that to decide. It's like, no, that's got nothing to do with it. It's like, do they have a natural affinity to the Force? Do they have the discipline to pick up on it, and the actual talent? It's like the idea that, because again, even Yoda is never shown to do anything super unbelievable with the Force in the whole saga, compared to, like, I mean, Luke projecting himself across the galaxy is probably the most amazing Force power we've ever seen. Yeah. Yoda didn't do anything like that, but he's got a high midichlorian count near 20,000. Anakin had over 20,000, but he didn't. The only thing one could argue that maybe, I'm not sure if it was him doing it or if it was the Force saving him when he's burning to a crisp on Mustafar and he survives. But that's another thing. It's like, I think that what George was making the point is that they've just lost, because Qui-Gon doesn't care about any of that stuff. He uses the midichlorian count to reinforce his belief that he already had, that there was something extra special about Anakin, and he was using the M count as an excuse to get the Order to listen to him about Anakin. Yeah, but you can tell it didn't make a difference to Qui-Gon either way. Like, he was already set on him, you know.
That's right.
He didn't care that Anakin obviously had really strong emotional bond with his mother. He didn't mind that he went to go have that big emotional goodbye. That's why it's called the Duel of the Fates. It would have been very different if Qui-Gon had lived and perhaps left the Order to train Anakin. And Anakin probably would have helped him go back and save his mother, or Qui-Gon probably would have helped him go back and save his mother. So you never know. And so I think that's all that's why they don't really bring it up again in any of the other movies or any of the other, Star Wars media. It was just like a thing to show this is how out to lunch the council members are versus somebody like Qui-Gon, who's totally in tune with the living Force far more than anybody else in any other Jedi in that film.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because
then you do see, you're talking about like fantastic feats that they pull because of that. You see different people, different Jedi masters do the same thing, which here's the fantastical, to be able to project themselves after their death. Force projection is the Force ghost. Yoda does that, but so does Obi-Wan through training and communing, the further training that,
And Qui-Gon was supposedly the first who could do it, because he went on that vision quest sometime before Yoda did. So he had to show him that. And yet Qui-Gon, as far as we know, there was nothing extra special about his abilities. He just, at some point, they retconned it, or not technically retconned, they just said that he had made that vision quest and communicated with Yoda and showed him how to do it. And then some of the others. Which surprises me that Yoda doesn't consider that unnatural. Like when he tells Anakin, don't mourn them, do not miss them, do not rejoice when they become one with the Force. But he's not talking about an afterlife or coming back. But when he wants to come back, that's okay. It's like, it's not a dark power then, but it's like you're kind of, as a Force ghost, you're sort of cheating death Not in the same way that Palpatine wants to teach us.
I feel like a million memes could be spun out of this conversation. Prequel memes. Yeah, no, definitely. I guess maybe it comes down to writing and convenience again. But also, I always took it as I like what you described. That Qui-Gon kind of uses the scientific empirical evidence just as a little means to an end to convince other people.
Mhm.
That kind of reminds me of Galileo, actually, a little bit, going back to that storyline, in using the current body of knowledge to try and convey a message, even though you might not really believe that yourself. It's a way of communicating a point in a, I guess, in a more trustworthy way with people who don't necessarily have the same understanding as you. Clearly, Qui-Gon, he says at the very beginning that he senses something great. He senses a vergence in the Force, and that term isn't really used lightly. But the idea is that there is such a kind of nexus, a high volume of feeling of the Force around Anakin that he perceived, and then that's the impetus for him doing the little blood test and seeing the midichlorian level. But really, that's just, again, I think George Lucas explaining it to a new generation that, oh, there's a scientific part to this as well, just to prove it in case you didn't believe already. Here's justification for my belief, because it is George Lucas's belief in spirituality that he's conveying. There's that old line that all writers, really, even high fantasy and speculative fiction and sci-fi writers, are all just autobiographical. Everybody's just writing about their own lived experience, and it's just colored in sci-fi fantasy shades. So this is George Lucas's belief, really, that he's conveying, and it's almost like if he didn't convince one generation through the mysticism, he was going to convince another through science. And I really wish we could have seen how he would have convinced the millennial Gen Z population with the sequel trilogy that never was.
Well, that is a good thing, and I think that's a great argument and as good a place to end this discussion as any. Is the writer making it meaningful for every generation, for as many people as possible, and making it meaningful for themselves. They're writing this, they're putting little touches, little sprinkles of reality even in what we've called science fantasy over and over again. It's those connections to the real world that create discussions like this entire show, is how you can use Star Wars to be analogous to the real world and to other genres of film, and to have such a wide-reaching impact. I think that's the amazing thing. So as for does everyone have the Force? It's going to be different in every Star Wars property that you see, because it's going to be, and it's a great thing that they are directed by a vastly different array of human beings who are bringing their bit of the world into Star Wars. So I think that's it. I think that's a really good place to do. There's so many further arguments. Please continue to argue in the chat for this as you watch this, and let us know what you think. And all of your arguments are completely and totally valid and right, and we will read them and completely may spin your idea off into a whole nother episode in the future. So thanks everybody for watching, and until next time, may the Force be with you.
Thanks. May the Force be with you.